if you're able to start. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Krymans, and I'm an extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Family Development. And we're so pleased that you are all here today for the webinar, Housing for All, From Awareness to Action. And I'm going to have you go back one slide. I would like to introduce to you Rick Meyer, who works with me in Extension, and he is going to serve as our webinar producer today. So if you have any issues, tech issues throughout the webinar, you can private chat him and he can help monitor that and help out. And Rick and myself and my coworker, Lori Hendrickson, who's also on the call, will be monitoring the chat. So we will bring any questions to the attention of our presenters. Let's go to the next slide. And I would like to introduce Ann Mavity, who is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and Emma Foley, who is a research analyst with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. So we are so pleased to partner with them today on this webinar, and I'm going to hand it over to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a delight to be here. I want to thank the University of Minnesota Extension, Sarah, Lori, Rick, for having us here, and for all of you taking time out of your day to join us as well. I'm going to briefly just introduce the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and then Emma, I'm going to throw it to you to just briefly introduce the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and then we'll jump in to today's slides. So the Minnesota Housing Partnership has been around for about 35 years, and we are a statewide organization that drives a lot of research on housing issues in the state, and then we use that research to help formulate policies and policy solutions and investments, particularly at the state level and then also at the federal level, to make sure that everyone has a home. Our mission is to make sure that folks, especially that are most impacted by racial and economic disparities, have an opportunity to have equitable housing opportunity. And the third area that we work in is providing direct technical assistance to small communities, rural communities and Native communities in Minnesota, but actually even across the country. So the Minnesota Housing Partnership is a little bit of a misnomer because we do work across the country with various small communities who might not have the capacity on site to address their issues, but we work with them on that. So Emma, do you want to introduce the National Low-Income Housing Coalition?
Yes, definitely. I want to echo you, Ann, thanking University of Minnesota Extension for having us today and all of you for joining. So I work as a research analyst at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and we do similar work, but on a national level. And so we're a nonprofit that conducts advocacy research and informs public policy to inform housing for the lowest income renters. We work closely with state partners across almost every state as well, and the Minnesota Housing Partnership is one of those, as well as conducting research, some of which I'll present today to help inform our advocacy and policy making. And then also with our policy staff based in DC, work closely with people on the Hill and other advocacy organizations to try and enact policy that will help the lowest income renters have accessible and affordable housing. So I'll stop there and pass it back to you, Ann.
Thank you. Well, let's see. Today we wanted to talk about a couple different things. One is want to talk about some of the systems challenge, about why are we in this huge mess and crisis over trying to have everyone access affordable housing, or housing that's affordable to them, because that's different for every person. So I want to first set that up, tee that up. And then Emma's going to talk a lot about some of the details about what does this look like? Why do we have such a mismatch between what we're trying, what we can afford and what's actually out there? And then at the end, let's talk about what we can do about this and how all of you can be a part of being part of the solution. So first of all, I want to ask a favor. I wonder if everyone is willing, or at least a lot of folks are willing to turn their cameras on, because I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm so old school. I'm looking for actual hands in the air if you can, and if you can't, an automatic one, but I love to see faces for a moment here. I wanted to ask you all, who, by a show of hands, electronic or otherwise, who considers themselves a housing expert? Anyone out there who considers themselves a housing expert? Okay, I'm not seeing a ton of hands. I don't think I'm seeing any hands. I mean, Emma, your hand should be up. But other than that, so I just want to say right now, I disagree with all of you. I think you are all housing experts. And by the time we're done with this, you're going to understand that and feel like that too, because whether it's because you have had stable housing in your whole life and you understand what an enormous platform that has been for you to go out in the world and engage and get a good education, do all those things, or whether you have struggled with housing, and understand how important it is because of those struggles, we all have a housing story to tell. So part of what we're trying to do, Emma and I, today, is to give you the facts and figures to make you feel like you're the expert on it. But I just want to tell you, you already are. You are already an expert. All of us have a housing story to tell, and we can leverage that story for big change in this world. Okay, so let's talk about some of the terms when we talk about affordable housing. There's a standard that we say, what is affordable? Because what's affordable to me is going to be different than what's affordable to you, than what's affordable to maybe someone you're working with or for. And so back in 1937, there was sort of an establishment about what does affordable mean. It was updated back in 1981, but basically to say about 30% of your income can be spent on housing that still allows you to have money to spend on other kinds of things in your life, right? So you need to buy food, you need to have transportation, you need medicine, you need all those incidentals. And paying more than 30% of your housing or your budget for housing squeezes that. Now, we know that's not necessarily true for everyone, because if you make $100,000, paying $30,000 for your housing is one thing, but if you're making $30,000, paying $10,000 of that only leaves you $20,000 left, right? So the lower income folks have a tighter squeeze, and we're going to see some of that in the data as well. But that's what affordable means. You should pay about 30% of your income on rent.
When you're talking 30%, is that gross or net?
That's gross.
Thank you.
So the other kinds of terms that we often talk about in the housing world is about extremely low income households. And so extremely low income households basically is sort of set to that federal poverty level. So it's at or below about 30% of that area median income. So in the housing world, and we have federal housing funding programs like the low income housing tax credit, which you don't need to know anything about, except that 30% of the area median income is considered extremely low income. In the metro area, in the Twin Cities, in Minnesota, it's hovered around 100,000. We're now up to about 104,000 is the median income, which is like that middle income level. But 30% of that, again, it's about 100,000, is it making about $30,000 a year or less? That's what we consider extremely low income. And we use that because a lot of our programs are missing what's needed to ensure that these folks have access to housing. And so that's where we are focused as an organization. And that's where I think the market misses, and that we're going to talk a lot about today. So the other common term we talk about is cost burden, right? So if you start paying more than 30% of your income, that means you don't have enough money to pay for food. You're burdened, you're paying too much for your housing. And severe cost burden is if you're paying more than half of your income just to keep your housing in place. because we know that that really squeezes folks if they need medicines, on transportation, on food, and all these other essentials. So severe cost burden is when you're paying more than half your income just to pay the rent or the mortgage. So in Minnesota, the challenge is, yeah, a quarter of all Minnesota households are paying more than they can afford for housing. So 25% of Minnesotans are cost burdened. And that is a challenge. And it's a scale at which we need to be addressing because of this massive sort of pressure on all these other systems that are trying to support low-income families. Now, one of the challenges that we have in our systems, and one of the big takeaways I'm hoping that you can have from this session, is that, you know, we hear a lot about people pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, right? Those kinds of phrases like, well, if people would just work a little harder or do something different, that it's some individual failure that they don't have stable housing. And part of what I want to impress upon all of you is that this is a systems failure. This is, we have created systems that are not equitably providing resources and assistance, especially to the families that most need them. One of the ways we see this is in rental assistance. We used to think about this as Section 8 vouchers. We call them housing choice vouchers. There's different kinds of rental assistance. But in Minnesota and nationally, of all the households that are eligible to receive rental assistance, a housing voucher, 3 out of 4 that are eligible don't actually get it because Congress only budgets a certain amount for it. And when that budget is used up, we're done. And so what you see, like in the Met Council a couple years ago, they opened up their wait list. The Met Council issues about 6,000 vouchers. They had 36,000 families apply for those vouchers. 36,000 families. And but they ran out of money. They can't serve all those families that need them. So meanwhile, all homeowners, right, who qualify for a subsidy through the mortgage interest deduction, they receive their subsidy. So to me, that reflects a lot about who has created these policy decisions and in terms of who benefits. And so we look at this and people have this misnomer that poor people are receiving all the subsidies when really the wealthiest Americans, homeowners, and especially the mortgage interest deduction has increases depending on the size of your home, are receiving the most subsidies from the federal government for housing. The other systems challenge is this. We can't talk about housing without talking about the racial disparities within housing. So, and in Minnesota, we are particularly challenged by these. So for example, in owning a home, we know that people of color are half as likely to own a home as white households. We also know that severe cost burden, remember that's paying more than half your income for rent, that people of color are 2.5 times more likely to be severely cost burdened than white households. And similarly, when we look at homelessness, that people of color are 6.5 times as likely to be homeless as white households. Now that doesn't happen by accident. That happens as a result of policies that have been put in place. And we see that in Minnesota, we have the distinction of being the worst in the nation on home ownership disparities, where white households overall have a 77% home ownership rate, whereas Black households only have a 25% home ownership rate. And there's all kinds of great Minnesota-based resources like the Mapping Prejudice Project and others that show how the federal government back after World War II and the FHA program where they were allowing folks to buy houses and subsidize those loans, but actually by policy made sure that households of color didn't have access. And that generational lack of wealth building persists today. So we know the good news about all of this is that policies created this situation and policies can change it. This is not an individual failure. This is a systems failure. The other thing that, we don't have enough affordable housing right now in Minnesota to meet just basic population growth, not to mention the need for housing that is accessible to folks at the lowest income levels. But part of that, it's like the big story is over 20 years. So you go back to the 2006, 2007 recession, and what you see on this slide is that creating new housing plummeted during the recession. And so we were tens of thousands of units short in creating new units just to keep up with population growth, which would have been that green line here. And so today we're in this point that we almost have to like overproduce for that year-over-year population growth that might be needed for new households because we're so far behind, we're still catching up. And the whole catch up will be about 20 years. So we know that this takes a while, and we know again that this is a systems issue. And so we're looking for systems responses. The other thing I just want to note is that Minnesota was a leader years ago, 20, 30 years ago, when the USDA created a program to expand housing opportunities for the very lowest income. They're often elderly folks or disabled folks in rural communities through something called the 515 program. This heat map shows you where all this housing is, and you can see that Minnesota took great advantage of it. And the challenge now is that all of those are coming due. And we don't want to lose those opportunities because towns in rural Minnesota, some of these housing, it might be the only affordable housing, again, for elderly and disabled folks in the whole community. So, so that's some of the systems issues. And then I'll turn it over to Emma to talk a little bit more about some of the reasons that housing costs are out of reach.
Great, thank you, Anne. And yes, as Anne said, I'm going to talk through some of the major challenges facing renters specifically using two National Low-Income Housing Coalition reports as kind of a framework. One of these describes the gap between incomes and housing costs, and the other describes the extreme shortage of affordable housing supply, as Anne also started to talk about. And both of these, I think, just provide ways that we can describe the affordable housing crisis and also think about solutions to address it. And so the first report I'll talk about is Out of Reach, which estimates the amount that a renter household needs to earn in every state, metropolitan area, and county in order to afford a modest two-bedroom home. And the purpose of this report is to highlight the gulf between renter wages and housing costs. Our most recent version of Out of Reach was published last year, and so the data presented today on this call is current as of 2021. As I'm sure you all have likely seen and experienced yourself with inflation and rising prices, a lot has changed since then, and so an updated version of this report will be out in late July of this year. So in 2021, a worker in Minnesota needed to earn $21.78 per hour to afford a modest two-bedroom rental home and $17.40 per hour to afford a modest one-bedroom rental home. For our research in this report, like Anne said, affordable rents are defined as those where a renter does not pay more than 30% of their gross income toward housing. And also when I say modest rental home, what we're using to define that is HUD's fair market rents, which are estimated prices for rental housing in the 40th percentile of the rental market. Using fair market rents as kind of a proxy for housing prices makes it clear that wages are not keeping pace with housing costs, which is shown here with the two-bedroom fair market rent in Minnesota, one-bedroom fair market rent, and different situations that a renter might be in and what they could afford. So for example, In 2021, the 2-bedroom FMR in Minnesota was $1,133, and the 1-bedroom FMR was $905, both of which are well above what the average renter earns in Minnesota. A worker earning the average renter wage in Minnesota can afford a rent of $861. In 2021, Minnesota's state minimum wage was $10.08, and a renter earning this wage could afford a rent of $525. This is important because low-wage workers make up a large part of Minnesota's workforce. Among the 30 largest occupation groups in Minnesota, 470,000 workers are in jobs where the median hourly wage is below the 1-bedroom wage, or the 1-bedroom housing wage. So this includes jobs like fast food workers, cashiers, home health aides, and janitors. And then another 230,000 workers are in jobs where the median wage is less than the 2-bedroom housing wage, such as nursing assistants and administrative assistants. Rent is not just affordable for low-wage workers, though, but also other residents, like those on fixed incomes. SSI recipients in Minnesota could only afford a rent of $263 in 2021. Next slide, please. And in addition to this existing gulf between wages and rents, since the beginning of 2021, rents nationally have been increasing at a rapid pace. This is something we talk more about in our report this year, but I just wanted to provide a little context for Minnesota specifically. Metropolitan areas in the Sun Belt and Western United States have been most impacted by these increases, but it's not an isolated phenomenon, and rents really are increasing nearly everywhere. Between 2017 and 2022, the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Minnesota increased nearly $120, which is about a 12% increase. Despite a slight drop in rents during the first year of the pandemic, which you can kind of see by this $5 drop in 2020, rents have since rebounded and at a fast rate. Next slide, please. And as Anne mentioned, we really can't talk about this without talking about the disproportionate impacts that housing costs and low wages have on renters of color. So the problem and the gap here between wages and housing costs is even worse for Latino and Black renters who earn disproportionately less than white renters due to decades of systemic racism and discrimination. The data displayed here shows the national 2-bedroom housing wage of $24.90 and 1-bedroom housing wage of $20.40. The median white worker, which you can see in the bar furthest to the right, earns $23.31 an hour, enough to afford a 1-bedroom apartment, but not quite enough to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. The median Black worker earns $17.81, and the median Latino worker earns $17.24, both of which fall well below both the 1- and the 2-bedroom housing wages. Though Black and Latino workers are overrepresented in low-wage jobs, Black and Latino workers doing the same jobs as white workers often earn less as well. So for example, within the workers within a management occupation, the median hourly rate for a white worker is around $38, while the hourly earnings for Black and Latino workers in the same occupation group are around $29 and $28 respectively. Next slide, please. And we also translate the housing wage into the number of hours and full-time jobs that a renter would need to work in order to afford their home. This just provides another way to describe the problem. And so for this report, we define a full-time job as 40 hours per week. And a minimum wage worker in Minnesota would need to work 86 hours a week or more than 2 full-time jobs to afford a 2-bedroom home at the fair market rent. To afford a 1-bedroom home at the fair market rent, a minimum wage worker in Minnesota would have to work 69 hours or 1.7 full-time jobs. Next slide, please. And Out of Reach also provides housing wages for each metropolitan area and county in every state. I am from North Carolina, and so I'm not going to try and pronounce the names of these jurisdictions in front of all of you experts in Minnesota, but as you can see from this table, there's a good bit of variation in the housing wages, even within the most expensive jurisdictions. And so the most expensive metro area listed here is Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington region, where a renter needs to earn $25.15 an hour to afford rent. Next slide. And you can see more detailed data for all metropolitan areas and counties by visiting this link, nlihc.org/OOR/Minnesota. And the website allows you to filter for specific locations to drill down to detailed data for your area. And I'll drop that link in the chat once we are done presenting. Next slide. Oh, thank you, Rick. Just kidding. Rick already put it in the chat. And so next I want to talk about the supply shortage, which NLIHC details in our annual report, the GAP. And the GAP estimates the number of affordable and available rental units for low-income renters to highlight the extreme supply shortage for particularly extremely low-income renters or those making less than 30% of the area median income, as Anne described earlier. And so the most recent edition of the GAP was released just a couple months ago in April of 2022. So that is updated for this year. And it found that while Minnesota is home to over 169,000 extremely low-income renter households, there are only 69,630 units that are affordable and available to them. Before we move on, I just want to provide a little information on how we define affordable and available. And so affordable is defined as we've been defining it this presentation, which is no more than 30% of one's gross income. And homes are defined as available if they're currently vacant or occupied by a household with an income that is extremely low income, if we're defining it for extremely low income renters or very low income. Because higher income households can live in and occupy rental homes in the private market that are affordable to lower income households, this means that they are unavailable to households with lower incomes. So those are excluded from our definition of what is available. Next slide.
Emma, can I jump in on one comment?
Please.
When we look at this gap of 100,000 units, essentially, the state of Minnesota funds the new creation of units towards that $100,000 gap, about somewhere between 100 and 300 new units per year. 100 to 300 new units a year, and our gap is 100,000. Just want to point that out.
Yeah, that's really important context. Thanks, Anne. And so, yes, perfect. And so given the shortage of affordable homes, many low-income households may end up living in housing that is unaffordable to them, causing them to spend more than 30% or even 50% of their income on rent. This mostly affects extremely low-income renters or those making between 0 and 30% of the area median income. 8 in 10 of extremely low-income renter households in Minnesota are cost burdened, compared to 6.9 out of 10 of very low-income renter households or those making between 31 and 50% of the area median income, and 3 in 10 Minnesota renter households making between 51 and 80% of the area median income. Next slide. And this pattern holds as well when looking at the number of units that are affordable and available to renters in these income groups. And so for renters making below 30% of the area median income, there are 41 units available for every 100 renter households. For renters making less than 50% of the AMI, there are 74 units available per 100 renter households. And then lastly, for every 100 renter households making less than 80% of the AMI, there are 100 units available. You can see that there is a match there, but there still might be a mismatch between where these households live or want to live and where there is housing available. And overall, this translates to a deficit of nearly 100,000 affordable homes for extremely low-income renters and over 75,000 units for very low income renters. And next, I'll pass it back over to Anne to talk about how we can use this data for action.
Thank you. So, you know, I used to do these presentations and just sort of end it right there, and everyone walked away really depressed. And so we didn't want to do that, because I am an optimist, and I actually think that we have an enormous opportunity in front of us right now. We used to say, how do we get housing on the, when people talk about what are the top issues in the state, right? We want to be on the hands in the top 10, not have to go to other digits on your feet or something else, right? So, and the upside of this horrible, horrible pandemic is that it really brought home the importance of home and the fact that it touches every bit of our lives. So the challenge is that housing is not like, it's not a system that is sort of like education, where it has a little clearer lines of who funds it and how that gets done. It is complex. The federal government helps provide funding both through tax credits as well as rental assistance and all other kinds of assistance. State governments are allocating and engaged in housing finance as well, and getting folks into home ownership. Local governments, maybe some of you have been seeing, there's the Minnesota Housing Partnership created a manual for local governments to create their own local housing trust funds. And we're seeing so much of what's happening out there at the local level now, where local governments are owning their share and their responsibilities. We have nonprofit developers, but also for-profit developers. The majority of affordable housing in this country is actually produced and owned in the private sector, by for-profit developers. And of course, then there's all of you who, if you're not yet a housing champion, we hope you will by the end of this, but housing advocates and housing champions that are all engaged in this conversation. So, so as we look at this, one of the things we realize, oops, hang on one second, there we go. We started this year, there's a Homes for All coalition, and maybe some of you are engaged in that and involved in the Homes for All coalition that's been around for about 8 years, a statewide coalition of nearly 300 organizations around the state and different housing champions again, who want to drive solutions to housing and homelessness. And this year, where we had a particular opportunity, where we had leaders in state government who were paying attention to housing. And we convened, MHP helped convene a group of folks, of housing champions, to say, we need to invest in Minnesota, to invest in families by investing in housing. And we proposed $2 billion of investments in 2022. And one of the things that we talked about as part of this campaign was saying, hey, housing, we know housing is all about health, right? We've seen that during the pandemic, that folks need to be, have a home in order to keep their health. We know, children were studying at home, school was at home, right? As kids are looking at the screen. We know that it was about jobs and economic competitiveness. So all these things are linked together to understand how housing is threaded throughout our lives, really. So I have a question for you to put in the chat. So everyone, get ready to put something in the chat. I want to ask you, what % of the state's budget do you think is spent on housing? So I'm going to look for a bunch of chatter in there. What % of the state's budget is on housing? We have 10%, 15%, 2%, 3%, 2%, 20%, 0.05%. We have a bunch of answers. So the answer is 0.3%, less than 1%. And I think that's sort of shocking to folks when housing is so fundamental to everything we do, that it's quite so little. So we are saying $2 billion seems like a big number, but that's actually just about 2%. It's less than 2% actually of the state's budget to be spent on housing. And we think that we need to size and reset our expectations on how the state should be investing in housing. So this campaign was saying, let's put $2 billion into housing every year to help solve these challenges. We know that 1 billion of that could go to help 8,000 families have a new place to call home, and 10,000 families will be able to stay in their homes, because we know, now you might have heard the term NOAH, which is naturally occurring affordable housing. It basically means housing that's affordable, usually because it's a little bit old and doesn't have all the shiny stainless steel and all that, but it's affordable and accessible. But every single year, we lose that affordability. So we want people to stay in their homes too. And we know that housing itself is an economic generator. So by doing all this, we actually create 22,000 jobs that will help sustain families. In addition, the other 1 billion of the 2 billion proposal to the state would go towards rental assistance. There is a big push, a campaign called Bring It Home, Minnesota, to have the state create a state level rental assistance program that would allow for universal eligibility, that anyone, not universal eligibility, universal access. So if you are eligible, you get it, which is in contrast to what I showed you earlier, that only 1 out of every 4 eligible family gets it. We're saying, let's make sure that we can do it at a state level. If the feds won't do it, let's do it at a state level for the health of our state and the health of our families, that everyone can access rental assistance. In addition, home ownership, we know there's a huge push because of the racial disparities we've had in home ownership, and generationally what that has meant, and what that can mean for the ability to sort of increase wealth generationally within families. So all of this 1 billion would help create first generation home buyers and let more people access housing. So we know these investments would reduce disparities that we see in housing and expand choice so that people can actually access housing in the communities of their choice, and not just by default in the squeeze, which the market is producing right now. So we talk about this as Yes to Invest, and have a whole campaign around that that's also on our website. And I'll put that in the chat in a minute as well. Sarah, should I stop sharing my screen so we can see everyone for questions, or should we keep the share up?
You can surely stop sharing. We'll need a few slides at the end, but stop sharing, and we invite people to turn their cameras on if they choose.
Yeah, and if there are questions, we're happy to answer questions, and I've missed probably some of them, but so I'm going to sort of go backwards to some of the questions I'm seeing. One of them asks, if we get the rental assistance, how do we get landlords to accept assistance as payment? It is a challenge, and that again is one of what we see as one of the systems challenge. There's something called the SOI, oh, I am going to have a brain snap. Basically, right now, property owners do not need to accept a rental assistance voucher as payment for housing. And we believe that is discriminatory and should be changed. And so there's legislation to say you cannot discriminate and say you're not going to rent to someone based on how they're going to pay that rent. So it is a challenge and a problem right now with a clear policy solution. If we can get all of you to take action, to talk to your legislators about this. Let's see some other questions. What conversations are happening around avoiding gentrification with new construction and affordable housing? Rebecca was asking. And Emma, if you have additional things to add, please feel free. One of the things I would say about the gentrification, it is a challenge. It's always a challenge. We believe, MHP believes broadly that we should have housing choice and housing affordability in every single community throughout Minnesota, that we need all kinds of housing in every community. I always talk about it as folks who are taking care of my mom right now, might be taking care of your kids right now, bringing me my coffee when I go to a coffee shop, all of that, that everyone, every community needs housing affordability for the folks who help make that community a great place to live. So on the gentrification, I know there's a lot of city policies underway to try and create inclusionary housing policies that say if you're going to put luxury housing in or market rate housing in, that a certain percentage of that housing needs to be affordable. So there are different ways to try to mitigate for that, or to, for example, have areas like around transit nodes, transit stations and all of that, where we're really trying to leverage those public investments to make sure that there is housing affordability in the areas around those kinds of other public investments as well. Emma, did you want to add to that?
I just wanted to go back to the very first question super briefly and note that, yeah, I think getting source of income discrimination as a protected class and ensuring that landlords, it's illegal to discriminate against voucher holders under the law is ideal. In the meantime, there are, I think different city initiatives of doing really concerted outreach to landlords, doing landlord to landlord outreach, and also doing, different incentives like paying for maintenance or repairs, so that landlords participate. And so I do think there are different creative ways to ensure landlords participate, because even if a person has a voucher, it can still be often very difficult to find a housing that fits that criteria.
Anne or Emma, could you define what gentrification is just real briefly? Because not everyone may be familiar with that concept.
Well, I think it's a challenging concept that is about, I think about it as when a district that may lack resources and investment, and you want to bring in resources and investment to make sure that it is a thriving community, that it becomes overtaken and loses the community itself that made it such a special place in the first place, gets displaced by higher income folks that have more choices. And I think we've seen it certainly in communities around in the Twin Cities, where folks get, whether it's an artsy district, that's sort of the cool place to be. And then after a little bit, they say once a coffee shop and a yoga studio are open up, that gentrification is already on its way, kind of a thing. But so we don't want to lose the essence and the strength of the communities that made the place a great place in the first place.
Thank you.
And Anne, I'm interested in hearing about this question. Elaine asked, what has been the legislative feedback, I think, around this $2 billion investment kind of push? Yeah. I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, so we feel like this had actually an enormous impact. So for the first time this year, the governor had historic legislative proposals for funding housing, the highest any previous governor has ever proposed for housing, in the hundreds and hundreds of millions. I think he was up to $400 million for housing infrastructure bonds, or $250 million for housing infrastructure bonds, and increased investments across other kinds of housing programs. Overall, it was about $1 billion for housing that he did in all the different programs. But the House, which is controlled by the Democrats, proposed overall $1.8 billion in investments for housing. That didn't quite reach 2, but again, it was historic. The Senate, which is controlled by Republicans, have more of a focus on home ownership. Typically, they have zero money budgeted for housing before negotiations begin. This year they had 50 million. So that's 50 million than we've had in the past. So we didn't quite reach 2 billion, but the House was at 1.8, the governor was over $1 billion, and we felt that we had moved the conversation. And again, our goal is to move the expectations, that we can't just go from funding, vouchers, or emergency rental assistance, 5 million more a year. We need to scale that to the 300 million a year we need to actually stem homelessness. So we feel like we made some inroads, more work to come.
So could I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you both Ann and Emma for your data-rich presentation for housing across the state. I happen to work in Northwest Minnesota with the Northwest Regional Development Commission, and one of the I guess challenges over and above what you folks presented on is even creeping into market rate housing. And that's, housing that wouldn't typically have an income limitation. But in rural Minnesota, we'll say Little Roselle County up on the Canadian border needs housing, and it's very difficult to attract private developers to come in and put up a 20 or 30 unit multi-family unit because of what we call the appraisal gap. And oftentimes a brand new building will appraise at about 80% of what it costs to build the building. And, the private developer may only be able to get financing for 80% of the appraised value. So we have this large gap, and private developers are telling us in these smaller communities that have very robust economies and a need for more workers, it's just too risky to go in and build. And so we're really looking at, what can we do to help decrease that appraisal gap and entice or encourage more private investment in rural Minnesota workforce housing?
Well, I won't address the appraisal gap specifically, but broadly, I'll say a couple things. One, we have worked very closely with, for example, Senator Mark Johnson, who represents sort of this some of these areas up there, and even like DigiKey and Marvin Windows and other companies that are growing, and their business growth is actually directly related and correlated to how much housing they can provide, where they're now busing workers in from an hour away because they don't have enough housing in their community. So to your point, workforce housing, which is more at market levels, as it were, is also in dire need. So we need every kind of housing, more of every kind of housing in every corner of the state. And the largest gap, that if the market's not working for those higher income workforce housing, it's just almost invisible and not even there for the lowest income housing, where the rents really can't pay those higher costs. So we need that in every corner of the state, and we just know that it costs more right now to build housing than what is typically able to be to have the market for. This is a challenge. We have supply chain challenges; those costs are escalating, and all of that. So, so yes, it's both and. We need all kinds of housing, and I think we need all kinds of policies at every level to facilitate that development, to make it easier to build housing, to make it easier to finance housing as well. I also will note one thing about the Northwest Quadrant. Minnesota Housing Partnership has started an initiative to identify new developers. Part of the challenge is we don't have enough people who are actually developing and creating housing. So there's a gap in actually who's out there who will do it. So we know there's lots of folks that might own small businesses on a small main street. So they know how to do this, but we want to get them thinking about housing as well. Put a couple housing units above your storefront on Main Street, or maybe even look at other solutions. So we are doing a lot of technical assistance and outreach to help identify a whole new slew of developers, including developers of color, particularly in greater Minnesota, who can actually help produce some of this housing that we need. It's a great, for any of you listening, it's a great job opportunity as well.
I
want to make
have
sure,
been working with
James, I want to
John.
make sure we're getting lots of folks. We're
Yep.
putting questions in here, so I think I'll run over to the questions,
Sure.
just see if we can cover a couple more. So we have a couple more that I saw on examples. There's so many examples on our website, and I think we can certainly, you can email us and we can give you more about, we as a large community, we know how to create good housing and housing that is responsive to the needs of your community and the needs of families. Some of that is supportive housing with links to services, and some of that is others. We know how to do it. There is just a lack of public will and political will, which is why we turn to all of you. On our website, we have in our research page, we have two things you could do. One is sign up for our alerts. We have something called MHP Connect. We send out about twice a month. And during the legislative session, it helps connect you to legislators. We make it easy for you to say, hey, it's a critical moment in your decision-making. Please invest in housing, prioritize housing. The other thing is that we have housing profiles for every community in the state. So if you go to our State of the State of Housing report, and you can look up county profiles, and you can look it up by state legislative district. So if you want those talking points for what's going on in your own community, we can give you the facts and figures so that you can go out there and tell your housing story, because you are all experts. Whether you feel like it or not, you are all experts in telling that housing story that you have. And we need you in the game. It's the only way things change, is when folks are actually telling decision makers what the community wants and needs. With that, I know we're running a little bit on time. I'm looking back to see if I missed any questions.
There was one question about felon-friendly housing and if there's been any research related to that.
Yeah, one of the things before this job, I was I led development for Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative, and one of the most exciting projects I did was a 72 unit building in the North Loop in Minneapolis for folks exiting incarceration. And it's funny because the North Loop Neighborhood Association, I've been to so many neighborhood meetings on affordable housing and siting, where you need neighborhood approvals and all of that. And this is actually the only one that came in with such an embrace. North Loop had arguments with the developer before us because they had too much parking. And with us, they just said they needed some new plantings. They embraced it as an affordable housing. So it's right down from the Twin Stadium and doing good work. But one of the things that we find, there's some research that's been done by a couple nonprofits. Beacon, Common Bond, PPL, and Aon are sort of the four big nonprofit developers in the Twin Cities, although Common Bond serves statewide as well, where they really analyzed how the screening criteria that's used for folks in housing and how effective that is, right? Like what screening items actually matter. And what they found was, by and large, of the array of things that we screen for, including different kinds of criminal backgrounds, that there's very few that actually impact whether you're going to be successful in that housing or not. And one of the key takeaways from that study actually was that folks with marijuana convictions actually are more stable tenants than others. But in any case, so I think there's a lot of work to try to make sure that the screening criteria that the industry uses is not, by and large, discriminatory. And there's a number of proposals and research and policies that are being explored to try to make sure that that kind of sort of one sweeping move to say, well, we're not going to take people with criminal backgrounds. Right now, it's legal to do that. And so we're looking for policy solutions to make sure that the things we screen for are actually data-driven and not fear-driven.
And if I could have you share your slides again, we have just a few slides at the end we want to cover. And I just wanted to comment on one of the additional comments that talked about the need to look at wages as part of the equation of affordable housing and how we might influence that as well. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to go quickly here. If you need a certificate of participation or you are looking for the University of Minnesota well-being points, we have those available to you. Go to the next slide for me, Anne. We need you to complete an evaluation. And so here's the link, and Rick is going to throw this link in the chat as well. We will also be sending a follow-up email to all of the participants, and Emma and Ann, if it's okay, we'll include a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. So folks have that. We'll include the link for the evaluation so you can give us some feedback and request a certificate and or those well-being points as well. So watch for that follow-up email in a day or two. And then also know we'll be doing a longer term follow-up email to learn about how you've used the information. And at that time, we will include a playlist for the recorded webinars in this series. On the next slide is this No Place Like Home webinar series that this webinar is part of. On June 29th, we have a webinar on hoarding. And then on July 28th, my coworker Lori has worked with some folks up in Itasca County, Lori, looking at rural housing and making it happen. So we have an HRA person and an individual from Extension that'll be presenting on that. And then we also have that main URL where you can check out all of our other Extension webinars. So that's, I think, all the slides I needed to cover. If there are any final questions or comments that have come in that we need to address, we can surely do that in the last couple minutes here.
I will also note, and Emma, I don't know if you have it at your fingertips, the John Oliver, that there was a recent on Monday night. John Oliver is he used to be on Comedy Central. I'm actually not sure what channel he's on, but he has a show that actually covered the rental housing market. And Emma just put the link in to it. And I will say, he closely consulted with the National Low Income Housing Coalition in informing his segment on the rental market. It is, I mean, a little coarse at times and sort of pretty funny, but it's also data driven and really amplifies, I think, what the information we gave today about, you know, what the status is of the rental market and why it's a systems failure and not an individual failure. So if you have a chance, it's a different way. I think different people learn and receive information in different ways, and he did a very engaging and effective delivery.
We will do our best to include all of the links that have been shared in the chat in that follow-up email. And again, the recording, you will get a link to that a month or two down the road once we get through all of our series. Thank you, Lori. Well, I am going to wrap this up at this time. Anne and Emma, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge and resources and research. I'm just so impressed with the data and your presentation and the conversation that we've been having in the chat here. And we will also include your contact information in the follow-up email that'll go out in a day or two. So if folks have additional questions they want to follow up on, they can definitely reach out to you. So thank you everyone for participating. We are so glad you were able to join us today. Thank you.